Hi, Vicki.
Hey, Wynne, how are you?
So I'm great. And I'm so glad to see you. We've been working on this format change where we
Yeah,
still do our podcast, but we start it with a story. And
yeah.
you and I believe so much in how storytelling connects people, how
Mm-hmm.
storytelling unlocks memories and other connections that people make. So
Mm-hmm.
it's so much fun to be here with you and to be talking about stories.
Yeah. Well, and I've got one for you this morning. Well, actually, I guess it's afternoon for you and for
Yes,
me. I've got
for
one
both
for
of
you
us.
today, right?
Awesome.
That I think speaks to the power of relationships and connections and remembering
Hmm.
and thinking about the lessons that we learned. And you and I very often do
Hmm.
that related to our fathers.
Hmm.
But when I was growing up, and some of this is sort of a reflection from Surviving Sue, one of the
Hmm.
stories that I didn't tell in the book about, my mom, whose life was really complicated and created a lot of chaos for the rest of us. But I've often written that my dad was such a hero in
Hmm.
so many ways.
Hmm.
With my sister with disabilities, my mom, who acquired disabilities really over the course of her life because of her dysfunction, mental health, and alcoholism, and then later her complicated parenting with my sister. But my dad, one of the things I watched him do when I was not quite 13, we had moved back to the small town that my sister Lisa and I were actually born in,
Hmm.
that was the same small town that my parents were from. And I kind of knew that, but I didn't really understand all the tension around it that I
Hmm.
was seeing in my parents. And I realize now, that looking back, that probably was really scary for them because
Hmm.
they left their small town with a taint, a lot of scandal
Hmm.
around my sister's, complicated birth and her disabilities.
Hmm.
But years later, they were moving back into their, hometown with my dad having accomplished a little bit, and he had a certain status in his professional career. And it was a strange thing to see people from their past, my
Hmm.
parents' past, come into our family life,
Hmm.
but they were all new to Lisa and I. But I would see these people that had these deep relationships with my parents and a lot of
Hmm.
history, a lot of backstory that I didn't really know. So I think my early interest in people behavior,
Hmm.
relationships, what
Hmm.
became my career later on. It's funny when you look back and you can see some of those meaningful moments,
Hmm.
in your childhood that really may have put an imprint, on who you become.
Right.
But about, I think it was December 2022, I'd written a piece about my dad and how he was always thinking about those that were overlooked or needed
Hmm.
support.
Hmm.
And one of the dear friends of his that I met had a disability, and it was my dad's friend from high school, and they called him Slats.
Hmm.
And I never knew, what his actual name was. But what distinguished him is that he had his left arm in a sling. So it was clear that there was a disability, and my dad was always very matter of fact about it. And so was Slats, that's how he came into the world.
Hmm.
His arm didn't develop in utero, but it didn't slow this man down at all. And so I remember, watching my dad interact with him and telling the stories, about he and Slats. They were both athletes.
Hmm.
Slats loved baseball, but was terrified, to try out for the
Hmm.
team. That level of ostracizing, in the
Hmm. Hmm.
'50s when he
Hmm.
and my dad were in high school was extreme. This was, pre Americans with Disabilities Act,
Hmm.
rampant kind of bigotry. My
Right.
dad told a story about some of the parents worried when Slats was little that what he had would be contagious,
Oh,
right?
oh, right.
And that, keeping him away,
Hmm.
from, their own children. And so just all of that, bigotry. But my dad, one of the things that I saw in him then that helped me understand his deep level of compassion for my sister and
Mhm.
her developmental and intellectual disabilities. Lisa also had at the time some emerging vision problems. She's blind in one eye. And so I saw how he would kind of counterbalance some of the negativity that we would see in my mom and how she treated, my sister. But it
Mhm.
wasn't until I met Slats that I understood the origin story.
Right.
Then I understood because I saw my dad with this man who was his, wonderful friend, and heard the stories about them playing baseball together, and they went bowling together, and they were buds, and
Mhm.
champions.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
Slats often would get teary. Maybe he'd had a couple of cocktails too, but he would pat my dad on the back and tell me that I would never know, just what a difference, you will never know what a
Mhm.
difference your dad made in my life.
Right.
And so I think about my dad even now and the lessons that I learned about being the one. And even years
Mhm.
after, we moved away. We didn't live in their small town very long. We moved maybe a year after we were there. But my dad and Slats, stayed in touch. My dad
Mm.
loved to ridicule, this man who had a nickname, Slats, because he was long and lean. He was like a
Mm.
bottomless pit. So they were constantly arguing, no
Right.
matter where we lived, about,
Right.
Slats who could eat anything. And, it was a very loving relationship.
Mhm.
And then years later, as Slats was aging, and when you think about the time period that they came up in, like I mentioned, the lack of ADA and protection
Mhm.
around
Mhm.
discrimination, same. There was no EEOC, at the
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
And I saw my dad intervene, more than once to kind of look out for his friend,
Mhm.
and stand up for him and about his capabilities related to jobs
Right.
and, being able to make a living and have a
Mhm.
family.
Yeah.
And so, you and I talk about storytelling and the importance. I think sometimes when we rewind and look at our childhoods, there
Mhm.
are those little vignettes, those little moments that matter when you see someone you love doing something extraordinary, but also ordinary at the same time,
Right. Right.
right? Just being a good person.
Yeah. Long before there were diversity, equity, and inclusion guidelines, your dad
Right.
was inclusive and showing
Yeah.
how it didn't matter if you were different, and he was going to love you anyway. And that's amazing.
Yeah.
Love that story.
And I think it translated, in a very powerful way for me throughout my life that
Mhm.
the other piece of it is my dad never looked for recognition for it. In fact, the things that I learned about his advocacy for his friend really came from his friend. My dad
Mhm.
didn't want the acclaim, he was
Mhm.
doing what was right. And I
Right.
think when we look at those everyday heroes in our lives,
Mhm.
feel so blessed, to have had a father who knew how to set that example,
Right.
you as well,
Mhm.
right? To look at that. But I think one of the things that I appreciated the most is that he didn't want recognition for it because it was being human and doing the right thing.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And what I love about what you've just said there with that story is that, you know, you moving back to that town helped
Yeah.
you understand something fundamental about his support for Lisa and his ability to
Yeah.
navigate the
Yeah.
waters of having a disabled child was partly
Mhm.
because he had a
Yeah.
friend that was disabled growing
Yep.
up, and that that story clicked for you
Mhm.
when you got to see that in action.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I have lived my life by, and I know that you're
Mhm.
the same, we love those checks for authenticity in
Mhm.
relationships. Everyone can be kind of nice and helpful in the moment, but it's that time served and being the
Mhm.
same person
Mhm.
across decades, of
Right.
our lives. Those are the things for me that really resonate. And you're
Mhm.
absolutely right. I saw my dad as someone who wasn't just being a good parent to my disabled sister, and he was, but it helped me understand that his consideration and his respect for others was
Mhm.
something that was implanted in him long, long before. And
Mhm.
it taught me some things about gratitude because my dad was also really quick, throughout his life to think about people that were less fortunate in terms of, um, people that were homeless,
Mhm.
unhoused, needing consideration. He would go out of his way, to buy food for people, less giving money, but he would make
Mhm.
himself late
Mhm.
for all kinds of things because he would, do what was right in the moment. So I think, yeah, it helped me understand him in a way that I'm grateful for.
Mhm. Mhm. And I love the way that you talk about, understanding his story and then how that's played out in your life
Yeah.
and in your propensity to help others and to bestow kindness. Um, I'm thinking about the story that you wrote about just the other day when you met a little old lady in a shoe store, and she
Yeah.
needed an opinion or and
Yeah.
just a little bit of encouragement, and
Yeah.
a- and the way that you told that story is a little bit similar to the spirit that you often talk about in your dad.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
is
and I
that
think it's an openness.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mhm.
It's an openness, and it's building on the legacy that your dad left you.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think folks that, have read the book that I wrote, about
Mm-hmm.
my mom, it I'm sharing this little, vignette and story. It's not something that I wrote about in the book because it was
Right.
very deeply personal, about a man whose family might still be alive, for all
Mm-hmm.
I know. But I was very careful, about who I wrote about, but I
Right.
figure it's okay to talk about it at this point. But I also realize, when people have asked questions about how my dad was able to tolerate all of the kind of acquired disabilities in a mental health
Mhm,
category that emerged for my mom, I think some of his ability to navigate and have patience, not just with my
mhm,
sister, but with all the things that emerged, as he was
mhm,
married to my mom. I think he had some training, along the way.
mhm, mhm,
I wish I knew more about his parents and where all that came from.
mhm,
But I think some of those qualities helped him um, protect all of us from some of the
mhm.
madness that was, my mom's
Right,
life.
right.
Yeah.
Well, and his deep compassion clearly lives on in you, and it's a beautiful thing to see. So I love
Aw.
that you told us this story that, just helps us get that little window of the things that we see, the things that we carry forward, the things that we pass on.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are limitless stories, right? It's just taking that pause and thinking about the gratitude moments and
Mhm,
looking back in order to be better in the present, but then also what you and I are always thinking about how to reach into the future and
mhm.
tell the stories that might be helpful for our own children.
That's right. Well,
Yeah.
and I love that you just gave me the perfect segue because I'm so
Yay.
grateful for you.
Oh, stop. No, we love swapping stories and we're
Yep,
grateful to the folks that are listening.
absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Mwah.